I have spent this past month actually reading public facing school reopening plans, both for K 12 districts across the country as well as for colleges and universities. One of the things that has become painfully obvious to me in both sectors, K 12 and higher ed, is that many of these plans are entirely raceless. I want to be fair to superintendents and to university presidents. They have a lot to think about and a lot to manage right now as they put forth these plans to bring back educators and students safely. But I am afraid that a raceless plan for reopening is going to yield um, racially disparate outcomes, as we've seen in other parts of the pandemic. Right, we have seen the pandemic, really play itself out along racial and ethnic lines, specifically having particularly devastating effects on communities of color. So I'm really afraid that these plans are only going to punctuate those inequities in the context of schooling. There are at least five things. Really, I have about 30 things, but in the interest of time, there are at least five things that I think educators, school leaders, policymakers, journalists, and others ought to be thinking about as we consider a return to schooling. The first is ensuring that we have trauma and grief support for students and employees who have experienced loss in their families. Again, we know that the health disparities in COVID 19 mortality has had a particularly devastating effect on communities of color. So that means that students and employees of color, teachers, staff members, school leaders who are people of color, are probably going to be more likely than are their white counterparts to have lost, a member of their family or a valued member of their community. So it is going to be important to ensure that we have the sufficient mental and emotional wellness resources to help those students and those educators cope. Second, as we know, every industry in the American workforce tends to be stratified racially, with people of color serving in the least compensated, least powerful, least protected roles, and the executive leadership roles being, overwhelmingly comprised and led by white Americans. That same thing obviously plays out in the context of the schooling workforce, right? If we think about who the essential workers are, custodial workers, groundskeepers, food service professionals, those are overwhelmingly employees of color. So as we began to reopen schools and these employees are coming, you know, every day, but yet students and teachers may be coming on a more staggered schedule, I'm afraid that we are disproportionately exposing those essential workers, many of whom are people of color, to risk of contracting the virus. So therefore, at very least, we have to ensure that we have proper PPE, contact tracing, testing, and cleaning supplies for those Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander and Asian American employees who disproportionately occupy those service roles, those essential worker roles. Third, the pandemic made very clear to us at the start that we have tremendous digital access inequities. And we've talked about that already a little bit in this webinar, that access to high quality, reliable internet and Wi-Fi, tends to be inequitable in, students from lower income families. And given the way that race and class commingle in America, it's going to be disproportionately students of color who don't have reliable internet and access to Wi-Fi. So we have to pay serious attention to, for schools that are going to be completely online or schools that are going to be operating in a hybrid fashion, that we go and correct those digital access inequities that we knew about in March when we first were catapulted to remote learning. Two more things. We've seen throughout the pandemic that Asian and Asian American persons have experienced particular violence as people have associated them with the coronavirus. It doesn't help when the president of the United States repeatedly refers to it as Kung flu and the Chinese virus. It further puts Asian Americans at risk. We have a center here at USC, it's the Safe Communities Institute, and they have been tracking violence against Asian Americans across the country since March. And it is absolutely horrifying. As I read these school improvement or these school reopening plans, rather, they don't mention anything about how are we going to protect Asian and Asian American students, faculty, and staff. If we don't pay attention to that, I'm afraid that we are going to be exposing those persons to violence as they return to schooling. And the last part of this is that as I've read all of these plans in K-12 and in higher ed, it is very clear to me that there's far too little consultation with communities of color, not just in the racelessness with which the plans are written, but the things that are being prioritized are not the things that I'm hearing from Latino communities, from Black communities, from Indigenous communities. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to racialize the input and invite people of color, families of color, communities of color, students of color, and teachers and school leaders of color. We have to provide them a seat at the table to give us feedback and advice on what our reopening strategy ought to be. Otherwise, whatever strategies ultimately are developed are going to leave out those people. And again, they're going to exacerbate racial disproportionality. So I think that there's a role for philanthropists here for sure to help narrow, the gap. Nonprofits can also step up in this way. They're, especially in cities, there's a rich or a vast tapestry of college access providers and youth serving organizations